this. It's 2020, the early, really chaotic months of the pandemic.
Oh, yeah. A wildly confusing time for everyone.
Right, and a video goes viral claiming that a common household substance, like something you probably have under your sink right now, can actually cure COVID-19.
Wow.
Yeah, and we are talking tens of millions of views, and the people sharing it, defending it, and in some cases actually drinking it and ending up in the hospital, they weren't, uneducated people.
No, they definitely weren't. Many of them had advanced degrees.
Exactly. We're talking highly trained, very successful professionals.
Which is wild because it completely shatters this deeply ingrained assumption we all carry around, right? This idea that raw intelligence serves as some kind of impenetrable shield against manipulation.
Yeah, we tend to think that if someone has a high IQ, they're just like naturally immune to falling for nonsense.
But being smart didn't protect them in the slightest.
Not at all. And that raises a really terrifying question for anyone trying to navigate the modern world, right? Because if brilliant, educated people can be fooled into drinking poison just because a viral video sounded convincing, what hope do the rest of us have?
It's a scary thought.
It really is. And that is the core mystery we are exploring in today's deep dive. We are actually going to use a framework developed by Dr. Osama Bouhentala.
Right, from his project, Think Like a Pro, Critical Thinking for Teens.
Exactly. But make no mistake, while it's framed for younger minds, the mechanics inside this framework are vital survival tools for adults. I mean, especially for anyone operating in an age of algorithmic feeds, endless misinformation, and AI.
Oh, 100%. Because we are operating in a totally unprecedented information environment.
Right.
Almost nothing in your digital feed is built with the intention of actually informing you. The whole architecture of the modern internet is designed to capture and just hold your attention.
Yeah, the algorithms basically reward whatever triggers the strongest emotional reaction.
Exactly. Influencers monetize your parasocial trust. And now, generative AIs can produce completely fabricated nonsense that has the exact same polish and tone as a peer-reviewed academic paper.
Which is terrifying.
It is. So raw intelligence just cannot brute force its way through that kind of environment. You really need a structured, externalized process.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can build that process, we kind of have to look under the hood at the hidden software running our brains, right?
Yeah, we have to understand why we naturally think poorly.
So to do that, let's run a classic experiment from 1960. This is by the psychologist Peter Walson.
Oh, this is a great one.
Yeah, so for you listening right now, I'm going to give you three numbers: 2, 4, 6. The goal is to figure out the secret rule behind that pattern.
Okay.
You can test any three numbers you want, and I'll tell you if they fit the rule. So what is your first instinct to test?
Well, most people look at 2, 4, 6 and immediately formulate the hypothesis, like, oh, these are even numbers going up by 2. So naturally, their first test sequence is going to be 8, 10, 12. And the researcher would tell them, yep, that fits the pattern.
And emboldened by that success, they test 14, 16, 18, and they get a yes again.
Yeah, and at this point, they confidently declare they've solved it. They're like, the rule is even numbers increasing by 2.
But they fail, because the actual rule Wasson used was incredibly broad. It was just any three numbers in ascending order.
Right, so 1, 7, 12 works. -50, 0, and 1,000 works.
Exactly. And Wasson found that nearly 80% of people fail this incredibly basic test. And they fail because they only test sequences that prove their initial theory.
Yep. They almost never test a sequence designed to disprove it, like trying 6, 4, 2, just to see what happens.
And that perfectly isolates the mechanics of confirmation bias, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Because it isn't just a vague tendency to favor what you know. It's actually a biological imperative. We actively seek out confirming evidence while blinding ourselves to disconfirming evidence. Yeah, and the psychologist Daniel Kahneman maps this out beautifully with his System 1 and System 2 model.
Oh, I love that model. System 1 is our fast, automatic, emotionally driven brain.
Yes, and System 2 is the slow, deliberate, analytical brain. Confirmation bias lives deeply in System 1. It is terrifyingly efficient, but it's entirely unsuited for finding objective truth.
Because System 1 is basically your brain's extreme battery-saving mode,
Yeah.
Like on your smartphone.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, because real deliberate thinking, like System 2 thinking, is metabolically expensive. It literally burns calories and drains your glucose levels.
And your brain wants to conserve energy, obviously, so it defaults to the cheapest, fastest path to a conclusion.
The real tragedy here is that social media algorithms are literally billion-dollar machines designed explicitly to exploit that battery-saving mode.
Exactly. They serve you endless validation so you never actually have to turn on System 2.
Which is wild. And forcing System 2 to boot up requires stepping outside of human nature, which carries a massive psychological cost.
It really does. I mean, look at the tragic case of Ignaz Semmelweis.
Oh, the doctor from the 1800s.
Right. He was a doctor in Vienna in 1847, and he noticed this horrifying pattern. Women were dying of childbed fever at drastically higher rates in the maternity ward staffed by doctors, compared to the wards staffed by midwives.
Which makes no sense initially.
Exactly. But he tracked the variables and realized the doctors were coming straight from the autopsy rooms. They were dissecting cadavers and then immediately delivering babies without washing their hands.
Oh, that is so grim.
Very grim. But Semmelweis instituted a strict hand-washing protocol, and the mortality rate just plummeted.
See, you'd think the medical establishment would carry him out on their shoulders, right? Like, he solved a massive crisis and he had the hard data to prove it.
You would think. But the exact opposite happened. The medical establishment mocked him mercilessly. They entirely rejected his findings, and they eventually drove him out of the hospital system altogether.
That's insane.
It's tragic. He suffered a severe mental breakdown and actually died in a psychiatric asylum.
Wait, so it wasn't a lack of data, it was a lack of character. Like, how do highly trained doctors just ignore a plummeting death rate when they were looking right at the surviving patient?
Well, it wasn't really about the data at all. It was about the cognitive dissonance.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Think about it. These men built their entire identities around being healers. Semmelweis was essentially demanding they look in the mirror and admit they had been the ones killing their own patients for years.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, the psychological weight of that was just too heavy for their System 1 to process. So their brains rejected the data entirely to protect their egos. They lacked what Dr. Bouhentala refers to as intellectual humility.
Intellectual humility. That's fascinating because it's so rare, right?
Very rare.
It's the active recognition that your beliefs might be completely wrong. It's about calibrating your confidence to match the actual evidence, not just your internal feelings.
Exactly. And a lack of intellectual humility leads directly to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Right, which we usually simplify as dumb people think they're smart.
Yeah, but the actual mechanics are so much more insidious than that. If you are highly incompetent at a skill, say, logical reasoning, you lack the exact cognitive tools required to evaluate your own incompetence.
So you literally do not know enough to see how much you don't know.
Precisely. Real experts, conversely, they see the vast, terrifying complexity of a topic, which makes them highly cautious.
That makes so much sense. So when someone online is shouting with supreme, unshakable confidence about a massively complex geopolitical or scientific issue, it is usually a glaring symptom of their ignorance.
Almost always.
So, okay, since our default biological state is to fall into these ego traps and rely on System 1 shortcuts, we can't just hope to simply be better.
No, hope isn't a strategy here.
Right. We need a forced external mechanism that makes System 2 wake up. And that brings us to the core of Dr. Bouhentala's framework, the Bouhentala Thinking Cycle, or the BTC.
Yes, the BTC. It is a 6-step process designed to basically anchor you to reality. The steps are clarify, investigate, analyze, evaluate, decide, and reflect.
And crucially, it's a cycle, right? Not just a linear checklist.
Exactly, because real thinking is messy and it loops back on itself. Let's say you encounter a viral claim about, I don't know, a new miracle diet.
Okay.
First, you clarify, like, what is the exact claim being made here?
Yeah.
Then you investigate, you gather data, but you deliberately seek out sources that disagree with the claim to avoid that Wasson confirmation trap we talked about.
Right. And then we hit step 3, which is analyze. This is where things get really rigorous, I think.
Oh, definitely.
Because analyzing means separating the internal logic of an argument from the actual truth of its premises. You have to ask 2 distinct questions. Is the logic valid? And are the premises resting on actual facts?
Yes. And failing to check both halves of that equation leads to literal historical catastrophes.
Like the Mars Climate Orbiter disaster.
Right. Exactly. In 1999, NASA lost the Mars Climate Orbiter. This was a $327 million piece of hardware.
Just gone.
Just gone. It didn't explode on the launch pad. It traveled millions of miles and then just disintegrated as it entered the Martian atmosphere.
And the subsequent investigation revealed something absolutely stunning.
Right, because the math they used to calculate the trajectory was flawless. The logic was completely valid.
But the engineering team at Lockheed Martin used imperial units, like pounds of force, while the NASA navigation team assumed everything was in metric units, like newtons.
It's the ultimate example of a false premise. They built a structurally perfect, brilliant mathematical model on top of an unexamined assumption.
It's like building a structurally perfect house on quicksand. You can have incredibly rigorous System 2 logic, but if your starting premise is flawed, you just march toward a disaster with total confidence.
What's fascinating here is how this ties into logical fallacies. These are essentially structural defects in an argument that our System 1 brain loves, simply because they feel emotionally satisfying.
Like the straw man fallacy, right?
Exactly. This happens when someone takes a nuanced argument, distorts it into an extreme, ridiculous caricature, and then attacks the caricature.
So, like, if I say, hey, we need to reallocate some of the city budget to improve public schools, and someone responds, oh, so you want to completely defund the fire department and let the city burn down?
Yes, perfect example. Our brains love the straw man because it provides the dopamine rush of winning an argument without having to do the heavy metabolic lifting of dismantling a complex, valid point.
System 1 gets the victory without spending the calories.
Exactly.
But understanding the structure of an argument is one thing. How do we actually apply this out in the wild? I mean, when I'm scrolling through a feed at 7 a.m. and I see 50 different sensational claims in 2 minutes, I can't run a deep philosophical analysis on every single one.
No, nobody has the time or energy for that.
So how do you execute the investigate step of the BTC in a digital world that's basically designed to overwhelm us?
You have to adopt the habits of professional fact-checkers. They don't spend an hour meticulously reading a suspect article to find the logical flaws. They use a highly efficient 60-second filtering mechanism known as SIFT.
SIFT. So that's SIFT. Stop, investigate, find, trace.
Right. And the first step is honestly the most important. S is for stop. Notice your own internal state. If a headline makes your heart rate spike with outrage or gives you a rush of intense validation, treat that emotion as a flashing red light.
Because that is the creator manipulating your System 1.
Precisely. Then I is investigate the source, F is find better coverage, and T is trace claims back to their original context.
But the real magic happens in the middle of that acronym with a technique called lateral reading, right?
Oh, lateral reading is the highest ROI skill on the internet.
Yeah, because if you land on a website making a wild claim, your first instinct might be to scroll down, read their About Us page, and maybe look at their citations.
Right, which is vertical reading, and it's a complete trap. Misinformation sites are beautifully designed. They use crisp fonts, professional layouts, and authoritative language. If you stay on their site, they control the narrative.
So lateral reading breaks that control entirely. Instead of staying on the site, you immediately open a new tab and search to see what independent, credible external sources say about that original website.
Exactly. You're basically asking the rest of the internet to run a background check. Because while an organization can easily lie about itself on its own homepage, it cannot control its reputation across the broader information ecosystem.
And we need lateral reading more than ever now because we're entering the era of AI-generated reality.
Oh, absolutely.
A website doesn't even need a human to write its fake articles anymore. AI language models operate purely on probability and pattern matching. They just predict the next most likely word in a sequence.
Right. They do not have an internal database of truth.
Which leads to AI hallucinations.
Yeah. An AI will invent a completely fake historical battle, generate entirely fictional statistics, or fabricate a quote, and it will deliver it with the exact same polished, authoritative tone it uses when explaining basic algebra.
Because to the AI, it's all just statistical text generation. It doesn't know it's lying.
Exactly.
Which brings up that really shocking case from 2023. A lawyer in New York was prepping a brief for federal court and used ChatGPT to do his legal research.
Oh, I remember this.
Yeah. The AI provided him with half a dozen past court cases that perfectly supported his argument. It gave him case names, docket numbers, detailed summaries of the judge's rulings, everything.
And he submitted it all to the court.
He did. And the opposing counsel realized none of those cases actually existed.
The AI had simply noticed the pattern of how legal briefs are written and hallucinated perfectly plausible-sounding case law to fill in the blanks.
And the lawyer faced severe sanctions, not because he used technology, but because he treated a probabilistic text generator as an oracle of truth.
The fundamental rule for surviving the next decade is treat AI output as a draft, never as a final answer.
Okay, so we filtered the bad information. We haven't been fooled by the AI or the viral influencers. Eventually, we reach the point in the Bouhentala Thinking Cycle where we have to actually act.
Right. The evaluate and decide steps.
Exactly. Doing this in a calm room is fine, but doing it under intense, real-world pressure is where the system usually breaks down, isn't it?
It is. To understand the mechanics of high-stakes decisions, we should really look at two historical events from the 1980s. They went in opposite directions, based entirely on how the leaders framed their evaluation.
First is the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986.
Right. The night before the launch, engineers at Morton Vehicle, the contractor that built the solid rocket boosters, had data showing the O-ring seals were prone to failure and freezing temperatures. They pleaded with NASA management to delay the launch.
But the management was under massive political and media pressure. They had already delayed the launch multiple times.
And in that high-pressure environment, they subtly but lethally shifted the burden of proof.
Right, because normally the question in aerospace is there conclusive proof that it is safe to launch?
But management flipped it. They essentially asked the engineers, can you definitively prove that it will fail tomorrow?
Wow. And by changing the framing of the question, they guaranteed a catastrophe. The engineers couldn't provide absolute 100% certainty of a failure, so management authorized the launch.
And 7 astronauts died because the evaluation step was manipulated by pressure.
Now, contrast that with James Burke. He was the CEO of Johnson & Johnson during the 1982 Tylenol crisis.
Yes, a very different outcome.
Someone had tampered with Tylenol bottles on store shelves, laced capsules with cyanide, and 7 people died. It was a localized event in Chicago, and the FBI and the FDA actually advised Burke not to issue a nationwide recall.
Right, they feared it would trigger copycats and widespread panic.
But Burke was under immense pressure to protect the stock price and follow federal advice. Yet he leaned heavily into the clarify step of the BTC.
He did. He refused to ask, what is the cheapest way to handle this? Or how do we minimize PR damage?
Instead, he went back to the foundational document of the company, their credo, and asked, what does our credo, which states our first responsibility is to the doctors, nurses, and patients who use our products, require us to do right now?
And that clarity made the evaluate and decide steps inevitable. They pulled 31 million bottles off the shelves nationwide.
Costing the company $100 million.
But they pioneered tamper-proof packaging, rebuilt consumer trust from the ground up, and ultimately saved the brand. The framing dictated the survival of the company.
So, to ensure you are asking the right questions before a massive decision, you need a mechanism to bypass your own blind spots. And the most effective tool for this is the pre-mortem.
The pre-mortem is fantastic.
How exactly does a pre-mortem work in practice, though?
So before you commit to a major decision, whether it's launching a product, changing careers, or moving to a new city, you gather your stakeholders and run a highly specific thought experiment. You imagine that it is 1 year in the future, and your decision has turned out to be an unmitigated, catastrophic failure.
You assume the disaster has already happened.
Exactly. Then you work backward and write down the specific reasons why it failed.
I've got to be honest. I've been in corporate meetings where someone decides to play devil's advocate, and it just derails the whole project.
Oh, absolutely.
It empowers the office pessimist to shoot down every idea and makes everyone miserable. So doesn't a pre-mortem just invite anxiety and hesitation into the room?
That is exactly why the pre-mortem is so powerful. It actually solves the devil's advocate problem.
Really?
In a normal meeting, pointing out flaws feels like a social risk. You look like you aren't a team player, or you're just being negative. But the pre-mortem changes the rules of engagement. Because the failure is treated as a given in this imaginative game, pointing out flaws is no longer a personal attack on the plan.
It's the entire point of the exercise.
Yes, it creates immense psychological safety. It gives everyone in the room explicit permission to voice their hidden doubts without paying a social cost. You identify the fatal flaws while they are still just on paper.
That is incredibly smart. Okay, so we have this arsenal of tools now, the Bouhentala Thinking Cycle, SIFT, lateral reading, the pre-mortem.
A lot of great tools.
But there is a really sobering reality check embedded in Dr. Bouhentala's framework. Simply knowing about cognitive biases does not stop your brain from executing them.
No, it doesn't.
Like, I can understand the exact mechanics of confirmation bias and then immediately open my phone and fall for it 5 minutes later.
Because insight does not equal immunity. As we said, System 2 thinking drains energy. You cannot rely on willpower to use these tools because willpower is a finite resource that depletes throughout the day.
So what do we do?
You have to offload the cognitive burden onto external systems and design your environment to outsmart your own biology.
Right. And the ultimate proof of that comes from medicine. The surgeon Atul Gawande spent years studying how to reduce errors in operating rooms.
And we're talking about brilliant, highly trained individuals operating under intense stress.
Exactly. And Gawande found that the solution wasn't sending them back to medical school for more training. It was implementing incredibly simple, mandatory checklists.
Checklists are magic.
Just forcing the surgical team to pause, introduce themselves by name, and verbally confirm the patient's identity, and the surgical site cut major complications by over a third and reduced surgical deaths by 47%.
Because smart people under pressure will skip obvious steps. The checklist acts as an external scaffolding for your system too. It does the remembering for you.
So what does this all mean for our daily lives? Psychologists recommend using implementation intentions.
Yes. Having a vague goal like, I'm going to think more critically about the news today, is basically useless. It evaporates the moment you get distracted.
You need to create a specific conditional trigger. Like, when I feel my blood pressure rise from a political headline on social media, I will immediately open a new tab and run a lateral reading search.
You anchor the desired behavior to an inevitable environmental cue.
You also need a protocol for when your emotional state gets hijacked.
Definitely. Under severe stress, or when facing the threat of groupthink, System 1 takes total control. You have to force a physical and cognitive pause.
Just stopping for a second.
Yeah. Neurological studies show that the simple act of naming your emotion out loud, saying to yourself, I'm feeling highly defensive about this argument, measurably dampens the activity in the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain.
Wow, just naming it reduces its intensity and clears the runway for System 2 to return online.
Exactly. And if you are navigating a difficult decision within a group, you can institutionalize that pause by using a designated disagreeer.
Oh, like President John F. Kennedy did.
Uh-huh.
He famously utilized this during the Cuban Missile Crisis to avoid blundering into a nuclear war.
Right. You formally assign one person the specific role of aggressively challenging the consensus. Because it is an assigned role, it removes the social friction.
The group doesn't view the person as a traitor, they just view them as doing their job.
Yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a profound truth about human cognition. Real critical thinking is fundamentally a social act.
That's so true. We romanticize the myth of the lone genius sitting in a room thinking perfectly, but history shows that's rarely how it works.
Socratic dialogue, scientific peer review, the legal adversarial system, they are all built on the foundational understanding that your individual brain is flawed, and you need other minds to catch the blind spots you are biologically incapable of seeing.
You need to actively cultivate a circle of 1 to 3 people who genuinely care more about getting things right than they care about being right. Because intelligence without a structured process is nothing more than a highly efficient engine driving you to the wrong conclusion faster. The Bouhentala Thinking Cycle isn't a rigid formula you memorize for a school test. It's an operating system for your mind.
It is how you make yourself genuinely difficult to fool, whether by algorithmic feeds, by sophisticated AI, or, most dangerously, by your own ego.
Right. Applying this framework fundamentally changes your relationship with your own beliefs. And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you to take with you this week.
It's a challenging one.
It is. Take a hard look at your own identity. Ask yourself, have you tied your ego to an outcome identity? Meaning your sense of self-worth is built on the idea that I am someone whose beliefs are always correct.
Because if that is your foundation, every piece of contradictory evidence you encounter in life will feel like a literal threat to your survival, and your brain will fight it.
Exactly. But what if, starting right now, you intentionally shifted to a process identity? What if your pride came from saying, I am someone who reasons carefully, seeks out the best data, and updates my views when the evidence demands it?
If you make that psychological shift, discovering you were wrong about something is no longer a humiliating defeat. It becomes a victory of your process.
It becomes a feature of who you are. So here is your challenge for the listener. Pick one strongly held belief you carry right now. It could be about diet, economics, or even a local issue. Spend just 10 minutes today deliberately trying to disprove it.
Seek out the most intelligent, articulate arguments against your own position.
Think back to the people in 2020 who drank a fake cure because a viral video manipulated them. They weren't lacking in raw intelligence. They lacked a process. Build your process and become impossible to fool.